one of the best parts about marketing is thinking through what is the human behavior that you are trying to influence? How is that human behavior changing over time? And then what are the things you can do with empathy to connect with these people, help them solve their problems so that when they get to the end of their journey, they come to you to say, hey, you know what, I want you to help solve my problem.
Hello and welcome to Marketing in the Raw. How are you doing, Deanna?
I'm doing well, Adam. You look different today. Kind of gelatinous.
A little rosy over here.
Little rosy, indeed.
Why are my lips not moving? And apparently I have no eyeballs. No, just kidding. It's close to Halloween here, but I know I was sharing this with you on a recent call. These are the Shackalicious XL gummies, which nowadays, for whatever reason, my brain, anytime I hear the word gummies, I just think this has got a bunch of CBD and THC in it or something like that, and that's not at all.
Careful.
That's not at all what it is. But I was told by at least one person that this looks like me rather than Shaq.
Wow.
I guess us all big-headed, bald people look alike.
No one said that. He doesn't have glasses on.
I guess that's true because that's the differentiating factor.
Yeah.
Didn't you somehow when we were out on the call, I mentioned to you about these or something, and you knew what they were, and this is the first time I'd ever heard of them. You've heard of the Shaq gummies before?
I have heard of Shaq gummies. I can't tell you how I keep up with the Shaq zeitgeist, but I do, and I was aware.
Well, the Shaq zeitgeist.
I know. Don't act like you're not impressed.
I definitely am. I mean, look at this. You could make like a little sandwich or something with these. They're so big.
Those are some serious big gummies. I would be concerned if a gummy's that big, does the flavor get less?
No, actually, I mean, I wouldn't expect Shaq to allow that to happen with his putting his name on a product like that. The one thing I did notice is there is a peach, a berry punch, and an orange, and there was like 2 berry punches, which is a blue, and there was like everything else seemed like it was all one flavor. So I was like, the colors need to be differentiated a little bit more, but they're all good. And don't tell my son that I took the last 3 or 4 remaining just before this podcast.
Your secret's safe.
Well, I'm wondering if he's going to come into my office and see the package sitting in my garbage and go,
not my delicious, humongous Shaq gummies.
Yes, that he's been probably dosing on every morning before we, come out and find him in the kitchen.
He probably got to all those berry punches.
That's true. He has a preference, I guess. But, well, I want to talk a little bit about who we're interviewing today, Michael Francisco. And this was a really interesting conversation because Michael originally has a degree in psychology. And we find when we have these conversations that there's a lot of marketers who did not start in marketing and who sort of eventually fall into marketing or, the world of marketing just uses its gravitational pull to bring them into its fold. But so Michael is one of those folks, and he worked at some of the largest companies out there. Microsoft, Microsoft, right?
I do. I know that one. Yeah.
Amazon. You just got a package. Was it yesterday? I called you and I could hear you doing something in the background, and you're like, "Yeah, I got some."
I did.
Prime Day stuff.
I did. I got some Prime Day.
And so he's been with Microsoft, Amazon, and GitHub. And so some of the most technical companies in the world, some of the largest companies in the world. But he talks about how he took a lot of what he learned being in those teams and brought them to smaller companies that he's worked with, and why he enjoys doing that and fostering the teams that he works with over there with a little dose of empathy, probably some psychology, but really a lot of leadership skills as well. Any of that sound interesting to you?
Yeah, I actually can't wait to hear that. And also thrilled that I don't have to put in the work of going to work for those larger companies to get Michael's advice. He already did that for us.
Well, that's good. Let's get into it here. I feel like I'm just meandering around, but we should just get into it. So here's my interview with Michael Francisco.
Let's do it.
Michael, welcome. I'm so glad that you were able to make it and talk to me. How are you doing, sir?
I'm well, and thank you very much for having me. It's a pleasure to join you. It's been a while since we chatted, so I was excited to catch up and happy to be part of the podcast. Thank you.
Yeah, and it was funny because as we were sort of setting things up, as most folks can relate to, is there too much light coming from behind me? And, is my camera set up all good and everything? And you said, let me go ahead and adjust my lighting back here. And I thought you were going to like pull down some drapes or something with the light coming out of the back. And then I noticed what you have there are bubbles and fish floating around. That's an actual aquarium behind you.
Yeah, that was my COVID project. I ran out of things to do around the house, so that used to be a big oak bookcase. So I rebuilt it, reinforced it, and installed a 90-gallon aquarium back there, which is great for aesthetics. Like I want to get on, like maybe someday I'll end up on that rate my Zoom room thing on ExtraQuote or whatever. But I didn't think it all the way through, so I've got now like daily maintenance on that thing, and I sit in this little office, and those fish are at about 86 degrees, so it's constantly very warm in here.
I was radiating heat. Well, it was when you were talking about being a COVID project, I was thinking, a lot of folks more often than not seem to abandon the COVID hobby or project that they had after everything cleared up. Yeah. And you now have a responsibility of continuing to maintain those fish, huh?
Yeah, another piece I didn't think all the way through, the daily maintenance and the regular cleanings. And on top of that, I picked a species of fish that's particularly sensitive. So if I let it go, they get very sick. They're very needy. And so I best plans of mice and men, right? I didn't think it all the way through. And now I have a extra responsibility, but I became an empty nester a few weeks ago. So I ostensibly have extra time, right?
So now these are your children at the moment.
Yes, the 30-some fish and the 2 dogs and the 2 cats.
I was about to say, and the 2 dogs as well that we were hearing earlier.
Yeah,
you got cats as well?
Yeah, it's a regular zoo around here.
Wow, you just need some flying things now. You got land and sea covered.
I have a weird bird phobia, so I'm going to skip that part.
Well, I want to talk about your phobias too much. We're going to dig in and talk about you instead. And so, Michael, I want to get to know you as a marketer even more, and hope that everybody else gets to do so along the way. Tell me a little bit about how did you get started in marketing?
Yeah, so marketing for me was I kind of lucked into marketing or accidentally fell into marketing. So I graduated college with a degree in psychology and a minor in Spanish. And it was pretty clear to me going through my internship that neither of those things were things that I was going to pursue a career around. And so I got out of school and did what you do, right? I went and got a sales job. In fact, I was selling health and safety classes at a local Red Cross, and then teaching first aid, CPR part-time alongside that. And, actually did use my Spanish degree for a while because I was doing it, in both English and Spanish. But I took that experience doing sales and ended up getting a job in tech, working for a company called Visio that was acquired by Microsoft, that old kind of LAN architecture and schema or diagramming tool.
I remember that actually. Okay, yeah.
Yeah.
What did they change it into after they renamed it something?
I can't remember now what it was called.
But I don't want to derail you. You're just bringing up old memories.
I am gonna go look it up after the end of this, or it's gonna drive me nuts. But yeah, so I was doing that, and that was an interesting process, right? Because it was, making the transition from successfully selling health and safety to doing inside sales for a tech company. I went through months of interviews on that, and the job I finally got was one where I had driven an hour to get to the interview, and I heard the same thing I heard every single time, which was, "Hey, you don't have enough experience." And I heard that every single one of my interviews, and I had finally lost my patience with the whole thing. And he asked me, "So what's the most frustrating part of your interview process?" And I'm like, "My frustrating part is that every one of these interviews I show up and the person sitting in your seat tells me I don't have enough experience. So how do I go get that experience if nobody's willing to give it to me?" that is really frustrating. I'm not sure how to solve it. Turns out he hired me because he's like, you're right. So here you go. So I got into sales. I ended up going to the Silicon Valley for 3 months between October of 99 and 2000. So right in the heat of the bubble, right in the middle of all of that, working for a company that was competing with, at the time, it was Placeware and WebEx. And, we got the trip to Europe and to the spa and the mountains and all that stuff. So I got to live that whole experience. Did that for a while, and then at some point my wife said I needed to get a real job. And that was a phase of my career where I was I was working hard, but I didn't really know what I was doing. I didn't know what I was working towards. So I ended up through a friend getting connected. So my last job, we were doing some open source thin client work. We were basically taking all those computers that banks very thoughtfully give to schools because they can no longer use them. And by the way, the school can't use them either at that point. So what we were doing is we built a Linux thin client solution that allowed you to actually take those boxes and then deploy them in your classroom. So you could extend the number of computers that the kids had access to. The challenge with that was it was all on, earlier versions of now I'm blanking on the name, but the open source equivalents of Microsoft Office, Open Office, those sorts of things, right?
Oh, that's right. Yep.
Yeah, and so because I had that open source experience, I got this introduction to a gentleman named Bill Hilf at Microsoft. So Bill was leading a group called the Open Source Software Lab inside of Microsoft, and basically what they were doing was, at the time, Microsoft was running this campaign called Get the Facts, and if you're old like me, you might remember that. They were running this campaign, basically working with analysts to point out all of the security and flaws in the open source or in Linux. And Bill came in to actually do something different, which was to understand what was it about the Linux platform that was making it so successful and what do people really like about it, and see what we could learn from that. It was a technical group. Daniel from Gen 2 was actually there. Like, it was a really cool group of people to work with. I was brought in as the marketing guy. So my job was to sit alongside this technical group and figure out, okay, what do we do with all this stuff we've learned? Eventually they brought in a gentleman named Sam Ramji, who folks may know as well. And we worked together, and I put together a program called Port 25, where what we did is we built a blog that talked about how Microsoft doesn't actually compete with open source. What Microsoft does is compete with open source platforms. So we compete with Linux in the same way that we would compete with Novell, as an example, right? And so I had this really cool job where I got to invite, and this was way back in the day where we were, Microsoft was the everything anti-open source, and got to bring in folks like the Apache Foundation, brought in Miguel de Icaza. I got to interview Steve Wozniak, and we bring these guys in and do interviews with them and talk about, like, what is it about open source that you love, and what is the tension with Microsoft, and how do we work through this? So we were kind of the pointy end of the spear of what became this transition that Microsoft went through, where now, if you think about how Microsoft views open source, they really have shifted fully into this mode. Like, open source as a development model, as a way and a means by which people accelerate innovation and build really cool stuff on the backs of works that the community has done. We were the pointy end of that transition. So I was there through the open source license project that Microsoft went through and all of that. The best story I have from that is we did a summit in San Francisco where we invited a bunch of investors. We invited a ton. We had like 60 plus open source, commercial open source founders that showed up to engage with us. And our message really was, hey, we're not trying to kill open source, but what we want to do is work with you. And we have this huge audience, and you should really think about building your products in a way that they work on top of the Microsoft platform to expand your reach and drive revenues. Turns out 3 days before that was the day that Microsoft announced that I think it was 63 IP infringements in the Linux kernel that Microsoft was aware of, and made some vague statements about all of that.
Yeah.
I've never been more popular in the press in my life. I was getting all these random calls to my desk back in the day when we had landlines on our desk. Hey, this so-and-so, Mary Jo Foley called me wanting to talk to me. The other half of the calls were people in the open source community who were yelling at me because they were all mad. And I knew I had made it when we showed up for our event, and there were actually protesters. We had people protest with, they had t-shirts and everything. And I actually went out I used to have one of the shirts. Anyway, it was a lot of fun. And that experience for me is what really got me into marketing. And it was what it was for me was the intellectual challenge of thinking through what are the market conditions, kind of what is the strategy that we want to take, and then how do we go communicate that to people and help them understand where we're going, learn from the feedback we get, and just keep iterating on that until we can get to a place where we have influenced those around us in a way where they believe what we're saying and they're buying in. And so that was my first kind of marketing experience. And so once I had done that, I realized, hey, marketing is where I want to be, and product marketing feels like the right place for me based on my background and just who I am. So I then took a bunch of jobs inside of Microsoft. So I went and for a while, Microsoft tried to compete with, like Photoshop and Adobe with their Expressions Design Studio. I was product marketer for that. I then led the unmanaged ISV business for Microsoft North America. And really my plan was, once I had decided that I wanted to be in marketing, I recognized I don't have a background. So here I am again in a place where I don't have the experience, right? But it made me rethink my career quite a bit. And instead of like looking for title bumps, so instead of chasing kind of levels and titles, what I started doing was mapping out like, where do I think I'm strong? What skills do I think I need? And then comparing that to where did I think I wanted to be? I knew that I wanted to be in a place where I could lead teams because I love that piece of it. And by leading teams, it also allows me to do something I really enjoy, which is take kind of the full context of the portfolio of skills and engines that we have in place and bring them together in a compelling way to actually go drive results and outcomes. So in order to do that, I knew I needed to get experiences across marketing functions. And so I was very thoughtful about mapping my career in a way where I could say, okay, you know what, I need to go to get some experience with paid and digital. I need to go get some experience in AR/PR. I need to get some experience in field marketing so that I had enough to be dangerous, right? And at least have the context and understand how these things work together, and then make sure that I was really specialized in one area. And so that's where I ended up. So I went from Microsoft, then I went to Amazon, got to work on the App Store, and was one of the first ones on the Alexa business development team, actually built out a partner strategy there. And then I went to GitHub. If you want to talk about marketing at GitHub, happy to talk about that. Led product marketing at GitHub for about 3 years. I was there about 3 years. And then each of those three roles, Microsoft, Amazon, and GitHub, all terminated for me in a place where I was spending more time navigating the organization and kind of thinking about like high level strategy and leadership and sitting in meetings and all this stuff than I was doing the work that I really, really enjoyed. And so I just made a conscious decision to kind of start scaling down in terms of the companies that I worked for to get closer to the work. And so that was why I went from Amazon to GitHub, went from GitHub to Sumo Logic, did a short stint at a startup, and now I'm at Liquibase leading a small marketing team. And it's great. I get to spend part of my day thinking about strategy and pricing and packaging and all that stuff. And I get to spend part of my day writing copy and figuring out like what are the things that resonate with our customers and our prospects. And I just love the mix of those things. At some point, this will grow to a place where I, need to go get closer to the work again, but I'm not there yet. So I'm really
well. Let me ask you a question about that. As if I asked you to tee me up for the next question, but you just talked about some really big companies, some of the biggest in the world, right? We're talking about Microsoft, for instance, Amazon, and you shared with us how you kind of consciously made a decision to go smaller because it brought you closer to the work that you were doing. Mm-hmm. What are some of the standout things that maybe you weren't prepared for in making that transition from that larger company to the smaller? And how did you either adapt or change to tackle those things?
Yeah, I think having spent that, I was almost, 13, 15 years that I spent in those three very large companies. And by the time I left, GitHub was indeed a very large company. When I joined, it was like 700. When I left, it was massive. Massive. It was a couple thousand people, right? And the thing that was most interesting for me was as I kind of went to the smaller companies, over here, there's a lot of structure and a lot of kind of top down. Hey, here's what we're going to go do. Here's the framework within which we're going to work. Everything has a process aligned to it. So if I'm going to go do a campaign, I've got, this team that does the design. I got this team that helps with the copy. I got this team that reviews. I got a legal team over here. I've got a, corporate campaign engine over here that I need to run it through. And then I've got to figure out the budget. Moving down, that becomes a little more loose. And decision-making changes, right? The way decisions are made is very, very different. Microsoft, we would set, and even Amazon, like set a strategy beginning of the year. You adjust that maybe at the halfway point, doing small optimizations as you go. In these companies, you have to be much, much more nimble, and the decision-making is very different, right? It's, you're more empowered to make decisions, but also sometimes it's a bit more complex because without that structure, like getting things aligned can actually be a little bit more tricky. Whereas at those big companies, it's, you've got to turn a big ship, which takes a long time. At these little companies, you got a lot of boats out in the harbor and you're kind of chasing them around, trying to get them all into the same place, right? So it's just a different experience there.
Was there a specific moment that like with a smaller company where you went, oh, this is different, and I got to do this?
Yeah. So at Sumo, I was brought on to help build a growth engine, and I had a partner that sat on the product side. So we were kind of two in a box trying to build out this PLG motion for Sumo Logic. And the moment that I had was I came in, did the work, kind of set up the models, and ready. We went in to go sell that back into leadership, and they're like, "Great, this all makes a lot of sense. Go do it." I'm like, "Cool. I need resources to go do that." And they said, "Well, yeah, we just don't have it, right? We have these other priorities, things we need to do." And it totally made sense to me, like the things that they were doing, but there was this kind of gap between, hey, we want you to go do this thing. It's going to result in work. And now we need these resources. And that was the first time for me, like, oh, now I've got to figure out how to cobble this all together, right? And so that was the first time, like, my initial reaction was, why did we chase this path if we weren't prepared to like really invest? But in the end, like the decisions they made sense. And shortly after I left, they had an exit, and as far as I know, it was successful. So it was just a different thing for me. Whereas before, we wouldn't have started something if we weren't going to see it all the way through, right? So I've had a few of those moments, but that's the one that popped to the front of mind for me.
You've also been the part of leading other marketers in a number of your roles, right?
Yep.
What do you have any sort of strategies for how you like? Have you been a part of actually building those teams as well, or are you predominantly responsible for kind of mentoring and working with those teams to deliver what you're doing within your role?
Yeah, so I've been the part everywhere I've been. I've hired people and kind of structured teams. When I started at GitHub, the product marketing team was a handful of people. By the time I left, we had business planning, kind of M&A and strategy roles out of my team. Like we were a fairly large team with multiple disciplines. For me, I'm not a person that does well in environments where you want me to come in and turn the dials and just optimize. Like I get bored and I see a shiny thing, I'm chasing squirrels. Like I don't need to be doing that. What I do enjoy though is thinking about how do you architect a team that has the right skills and enough overlap between those skills that you can get more out of that group than you would, hiring differently. I think for me, there's this concept of hiring athletes. So people, or the T-shaped marketer, I guess is the term, right? Mm-hmm. Where you're broad enough that you can understand how the other disciplines work and what they need from each other, but you're very specialized in one area, right? And that's the kind of team that I look for in terms of that way. I think we get better collaboration and kind of more output or more quality output as a result of that. I also think that the hiring that we do or that I've done is really built around the strategy itself. So, once you define what it is you need to go to market, you need to hire around that for people and so that they can kind of fill the needs of that strategy and actually see it all the way through. But I think the third piece of all this hiring, kind of as we think about hiring, I know it's not exactly the question you asked, but it's how I think about building teams.
Yeah.
Is I like to hire people that, again, as I mentioned, are strong in one area, but are looking to grow, right? So I tend to bias for people who are ready to make that next step in their career at whatever level they're at, and put them in a position where they have one foot in the batter's box, right? So they know one foot is firmly planted in a place they understand and they know, and then give them stuff outside of that so that they can then have this area where they're constantly experimenting and learning and growing. What I've seen over time is that the most success I've had in building kind of happy and healthy teams is when you give people opportunity. You find people who want to stretch, and then you let them stretch as far as they can with putting enough guardrails there so they don't like go farther than they think they should.
How do you put those guardrails up? Like, give us an example of
Yeah.
what they might look like.
Yeah. So, for example, if I have somebody come in who's a product marketer as an example, right? I will take that role and say, hey, based on what I understand of you, here's the scope of what that is, right? Here's the scope of what I think this role is. And then I'll find a thing next to it that says, hey, here's this other piece. Like maybe it's, I want you to go lead a tier 2 product launch that's going to take cross-functional collaboration across the organization to go make this thing happen. So here, I want you to lead this. I'm going to stay really close to it. The second time might be, you know what, I'm just going to let you lead this and you come back to me and let me know how it's going, right? And just continue to expand that so that I'm not setting them up for failure because I'm asking them to do something that they aren't getting the right support for. B, they feel like I trust them and that they have the comfort to know that I'm there for them. And then the last piece of that is that they see, yeah, I've done this right. Now he trusts me. And now look, he's giving me another thing, right? And so it's helping them grow thoughtfully in a way that we don't lead them to Peter principle, right? You never want to put somebody in that position. And so as I've done that over time, what I find is people, feel like they're learning, which is the most important thing. They feel like they're growing and like their next role, wherever that might be for me or somewhere else, is going to be, a bigger role with more responsibility. Now they've had this experience they can talk to. And then most importantly is they feel like they're working with somebody who actually cares about what's important to them. And I think if you can do that, you end up with a team that is constantly trying to stretch. In role, they are gaining skills, so they're much stronger in that role, a year in than they were when they started. So I'm getting more out of them and more thinking and more kind of collaboration and more output. But there's also this sense of trust and calm especially in kind of startup environments. It can get a little hectic. It can get a little tension at times.
Yeah.
But what I can control is what's happening inside my team. And as long as within the team, there's a good culture and a good esprit de corps, what's happening around us is more manageable. And so that's kind of the way that I think about it.
What is a good marketing team culture? I mean, there's this business culture, right? And there's the company values and culture that should permeate all the way through marketing. But is there sort of this is not the best way to say it, but like a subculture within how you lead a good marketing team? What role does that play into the success of that team? Does passion have anything to do with it? What kind of, I would say, motivation or incentives is not the right way, because incentive starts to talk about things like, it feels like you're talking about money. But I'm really going beyond that. Is there what goes into that subculture, if it even exists, and how do you identify or foster that?
Yeah. So I think in my experience, it does exist. And I think there's a few outside variables that, I think about in every company, right? So in some companies you go to, there's perhaps a tension between sales and marketing, right? Like marketing, hey, we're doing a bunch of really cool stuff. Sales is like, your stuff's garbage. We can't sell anything on it, right? There's that tension. There's the tension for results, particularly in small startup companies where, you're constantly tracking that ARR number and working it down and saying, well, where are the MQLs and, kind of having that. So there's a lot of pressure that comes in on marketing. And then the third thing is a lot of people don't understand what marketing is, right? Like, especially, and I think, I don't know how it is today. I haven't been there in a while, but when I joined GitHub, there was this kind of known thing that being at GitHub as a marketer was a tough place to be, because they are very much developer engineering led, made a lot of sense. Those folks didn't trust marketing to have the competency to tell the story. Sellers didn't trust marketing to have the competency to understand what they were dealing with and understand the customers. And so when you have those sorts of, things going on around the team, what you need is inside the team, a group of people who all share the same vision. So setting, the mission and the vision for what you want to accomplish in a very kind of understandable and credible way, being able to then understand how everybody ladders up to that, and then building this kind of culture of rapid iteration, test, experiment, optimize, and move forward. You end up with this culture of people who are all working towards the same goal. They're supporting each other and doing the things they want to do, but they're seeing everybody around them work really hard to get to this goal, and it inspires them to do the same. And that starts, I think, with the leader. For me, if I'm not putting that sort of effort out, I can't expect them to as well. And so it ends up in this kind of self-fulfilling cycle of people doing great thinking because that's where it starts. If you do great thinking, make good decisions, we act quickly, we execute, we care about the quality, and we help each other. That just creates this kind of, like I said, this self-fulfilling culture of people wanting to help, all moving in the same direction and then celebrating our own wins. And if we can feel good about what we're doing, then it makes the work more enjoyable. You use the word passion. I like to think that we all have passions that exist outside work, but I think it's important to enjoy the work that you do, right? If people are living to do their job, and I consider marketing my hobby, so maybe I'm a bit of a hypocrite here, but I think that, if you, however you think about your daily work, it is my life, it is a means to an end, whatever it is, if you don't enjoy it, then it's really hard to come sit down for 8, 10, however many hours a day you're working and actually put your best self into it, right? And so I can't control, how important the job is to the individual, but what I can control is how much they enjoy what they're doing. And in the moments when it's not enjoyable, like you're under a little extra scrutiny, things aren't working right, making sure they have the right support so they feel safe, right? Because you can feel safe but not enjoy what you're doing. And as long as you feel safe, you're going to work through that and get back to that place where you enjoy what you're doing.
Was there ever a time in working with your marketing team where a particular team member or maybe a couple of team members, just things were just not hitting right? You weren't getting the results you were expecting, the work that was getting out of it. There was some cross communication issues, whatever it may be, some challenges. And at first glance, you're just like, wow, I don't really know if this teammate is the right fit. There's something going on here where I don't feel like this. And then in retrospect, you realized it was you. It was something that, like, in the sense of an I you didn't dot or a T didn't cross. So just generally speaking, like, just a different way of thinking about it, you unlocked and realized, like, oh, it's something about the vision that I shared. It's me as a leader that I miss this particular thing. I'm interested to hear what you have on that.
Yeah, I mean, yes. It's easy. There's a few different examples I have of this, right? So I'm going to break this into 2 stories. So one of these is you see somebody and they're not performing, they're not doing, like, either the work quality isn't good or you're not getting the right outcomes. Sometimes as a manager, it's because you've misevaluated where their strengths are and haven't put them in a place to be successful. You've looked at them and said, hey, they've been doing this for a long time, or hey, I think they'll be good at this. And you do a misevaluation, you put them in a spot. And that's my fault for not evaluating kind of the skills and competencies and areas of interest the right way. So you look at that and you say, gosh, this one way to look at that is, well, they're just failing at their role. But you could also look at it and say, did I put them in a position to succeed? And so I've had that happen in the past where it's like, hey, not performing over here so well, but I've got this other thing happening over here. And based upon the way they work, I think this is a much better fit. And I'm going to stay away from specific stories because if people who are watching this are going to identify themselves, and I don't want to do that. But getting people in a place where their skills, interests, and goals align to the work that you're asking them to do is really important. I've made that mistake, right, where I put somebody in the wrong position and ended up that all I had to do was move them, and all of a sudden their career took off because we got them in the right spot. There's another piece of this that is a really important piece around how is it that I communicate what it is that I want and what I need. And one of the things I've had to personally work on is making sure that the way that I think and kind of what I expect or want to see is very clearly communicated, right? And it lives in my head, so it's really easy for me to understand, right? And so I think I'm going out and saying it, but it's not actually clear to the individual. And I think this comes through, like the best example of this is around content, right? Like if I want to see a specific thing, in tone and voice in particular is where this is a great example of this. If I want to see content for the website have a certain tone and feel, and I'm not seeing that off, the first thing I go look at is like, am I doing a good job of communicating what specifically it is that I'm looking for? And I found that I've made that mistake too, where people are trying to do their best with some thing that I gave them, right? It clearly didn't make sense, but they're doing their best and they think they're giving what I asked for. But it was my fault because I didn't actually communicate it in a way that was super clear and effective. And so often in those situations, one of the first things I do is go back and talk to them. I'm like, well, what is it that you think? Like, play back to me what you think it is that I want to see here, so that I can understand what was the message that they heard versus me going and repeating no, I want this. I'm just saying the same thing over again. Like, taking that moment to check myself and say, all right, what is it you heard? Oh, you heard that? That's not actually what I meant. So here's how I would adjust that. And then let's talk through it and make sure we get to the right place. So I try to avoid that by kind of having that conversation in the first conversation, right? Like, so I've given you this guidance. Does it make sense? Tell me what you think you heard. That'll help me make sure I'm giving them the right feedback. And I think, because the truth is, people want to do good work. Like, most people don't show up at work people I work with and that I hire don't show up to work just to check a box and write it out. They want to do good work. Again, going back to that point about you should enjoy your job, like, you should also feel like you're accomplishing something, right? If you're going to spend, 40 hours plus a week doing a thing, you should feel like you've accomplished something. Going back to my statement about why I wanted to scale down teams, I got to a place where, like, mowing my lawn every week was the best part of my week, because I could mow my lawn. I'm like, look, I did something. Right? Something got accomplished. I did this. Right. And so you want to make sure.
You weren't kicking the can, kicking it. And
right.
Nothing was getting done. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. I would kick the can and it would just come back to me, and I'd kick it again and it would just come back. Right. And it's, at that level, it just never feel like I was accomplishing a thing. And so you want people to feel like they're doing good work, and it's achieving and it's contributing to an end. And so being really clear about what you expect, what you want, and then checking that with them so that you are certain that you're on the same page is really important.
I love that. Thinking about, initially how to set that vision, but then not making assumptions, obviously, that the way that you keep communicating it is it goes to communication with friends, spouses, family, friends. You can't assume that the way that it is in your head is always clear to everybody else. And so I love that technique of just at least asking folks, so how are you understanding this, and then sort of clarifying from there. As my COO says, and I love it, is seek to understand.
Yep.
Seek to understand first before you jump in, and you're generally, a lot of folks seek to judge initially. And so seek to understand, and once you get understanding, then you can speak from that place of understanding, and that's to some extent, I think, what you described. That's really awesome. I want to go back also to something else that you mentioned, which was around, really it was at GitHub, and I think that this happens with a lot of technical companies where you have different stakeholders that speak different languages. Okay. So, and in more technical companies and folks that are offering technical solutions, SaaS, software, all that sort of stuff, the product is often being built by and then also sold to folks that are more technical. They're in the nitty-gritty of things. And as marketers, you can't always be on the same page, or not the same page, but you're not always coming from the same cloth, so to speak. You weren't a former DevOps person or a former software developer or somebody, dealing with cybersecurity per se. You can be. That does end up happening. But in my experience, I often find that the best marketers, this is how we've worked with our clients, are the ones that can be polyglots. They're ones that can have conversations as close to in the language of the individual stakeholders they're talking to, right? So they're going to be talking to sales at some point, be talking to the developers at another point, be talking to the customers at another point, the executives at the company, the engineers or whomever. And so being able to get entrenched in those different stakeholder groups and have conversations, I believe can kind of allow you to become almost like a translation device, so to speak, between the groups to then ultimately pull all that together and output that as communication pieces, as messaging, as marketing. What's been your experience in that space, given that you work with so many technical companies? I mean, you talked about kind of the experience of having to deal with that at one company. I would imagine there's some version of that continues to follow through all the companies you're working at.
Yeah, it's really about building trust is what it comes down to, right? Like, how do you build trust with these other stakeholders such that they believe you can do what you've signed up to go do for the company, right? And we'll use GitHub as an example. When I joined, it was right before Nat Friedman took over. And so Nat, great guy. And I would tell Nat that, hey, I have told Nat this, that he's marketing skeptical at best, right? He very, very technically oriented. He speaks the developer language, very smart guy, but was skeptical of what marketing was doing. And part of that was because marketing wasn't doing a good job of explaining what it is they do, right? And so part of what we focused on was kind of two things. One, taking the work we do and putting that into frameworks that were really easy for people to understand and then very credible, right? So by going to actually getting deep in the numbers, saying, hey, here's the thing we did, here's the outcome, here's how these numbers work together, so they can look at it on paper and say, okay, the math makes sense, right? So put it in a language that they could understand, so they could say, oh yeah, you actually are being thoughtful about this. Oh, and there is like, it's not just this fluffy, soft science that you guys sit over there and do, right? Like, is that marketing? What do they do? Oh, they build PowerPoint decks that the sellers don't use, right? That's not what we do. They create shiny, colorful ads that we put out there and the developers ignore. That's not what we do, right? We do a lot more than, creating decks and working with sales to like help them influence customers. We do more than creating ads that resonate with customers and get them to take an action that leads them to a community, that leads them to documentation, leads them to raise their hand down the road. There is a lot of hard science that goes into it, and being able to demonstrate that is one thing. Then in the other piece of that, so once you've started building some credibility, then it's about building trust. And at GitHub, what I did was said, hey, I went to the different product groups that my team supported and said, we're having a communication challenge where decisions are being made over here and then stuff's kind of getting thrown over the wall, and we're not able to react and respond, A, because we're finding out too late, or B, because we could have provided some input that would have made this easier for the whole process. So I got agreement from the different product leads that, hey, I want to take a PMM and embed them in your team. So for your team meeting, not for all of them, I don't need to be at your stand-ups and other things, but for the relevant meetings, let the PMM sit in and listen. And so they agreed to that. And it took about a little time, but over time they came back to me and like, hey, so-and-so was in my meeting and, they had some really good input. We hadn't thought about it that way. Right. And so getting them to like take that step, say, let them be there. I coach the PMMs, say, hey, look, you need to go listen, you need to understand, and then speak about the things that you can credibly speak to. Don't tell them how to build the product, but talk about what's the impact of this. And so as we did that, then all of a sudden the PMMs became like extended parts of those product teams, because now they were building trust and they saw, oh, this is what they do. We talk about it this way. They need to go talk to an IT decision maker. And so they've taken our words, they're the same words put in a different format to resonate for people because they care about it for a different reason. Right. And so that once we started doing that, that helped build trust. And it's a thing that I've tried to do kind of in all my roles, is like really, whether it's with sales, whether it's with product, like figure out a way that you can show them that you're creating value and that you're doing it in a thoughtful way to create that credibility, and then go work with those folks to build the trust so they can see like, hey, I am here to help you. Like the line I give our sellers is like, look, my job as a marketer is to help you make a lot of money, because if you are out there making a lot of money, that's good for the company and that's good for all of us. So like really getting down to what matters to them and building that trust is super important.
So the answer isn't just scream, why aren't you listening to me? Just let me do my job.
Yeah.
It's a little bit more of that, seek to understand. And in addition to that, you understand better by, oftentimes folks are having separate conversations. And to some extent, what you described is being willing to be a part of those other conversations that are happening, and not just as a fly on the wall, but as an active participant to what's going on. I also love how you were saying, like, don't give them feedback on how to build the product and all that. You might have some good advice on that.
Yeah.
But at that point, I think you get interpreted as somebody who's crossing a line at that point. But when you were able to stay within your lane, but apply it to the conversation that's being had, I think to your point of that's a great trust building tool. When folks go, oh, now I get it, and both simultaneously, are you able to gather a lot of great information to help you with your job, but you're also exposing your process to some extent. You're exposing the way that you think. It reminds me of, there was this graphic that somebody shared on LinkedIn recently, which was kind of like this iceberg thing or whatever, where it was like, here's all the things that people see that marketing does. Here's all the stuff that happens behind the scenes that are done within the brains of the marketers, doing the strategy, listening, trying to sort of chew on and process what's being told to them by all the different stakeholders and the market and all the data that's going on, in order to ultimately provide that output. And by having a conversation like you're talking about, or being a part of that conversation, you do expose that a little bit, so people go, oh, they're not just doing the deliverables. They're not just, like you said, making the shiny objects. I want to ask you, so in your experience, you have worked both with kind of the hands-on, maybe more creative side of the equation. You definitely, as a leader within marketing teams, and in the organization overall as a marketer, you have that human element, as we call it with Secret Sushi. We say, the heart in science. Actually, I have my little, on my water bottle here, it says, I practice the heart and science of marketing. And you also are very technically minded. You make decisions looking at data, and there's tools that you use that are much more technical and everything. How do you feel, especially in a world of technical solutions or businesses that are providing technical solutions and have all these technical minded folks? How do you balance, whether it's yourself or it's yourself and your team, that kind of heart and science, the creative side, and the more sort of data driven side of marketing as you make decisions and execute things?
Yeah, I mean, there's things we know and things we think we know and things we know we don't know, right? And so as I think about it, right, I can use my current company as an example here. I came in and we just kind of needed to reset the marketing organization. So we took a kind of a planful approach, quarter to quarter, kind of building what we needed to build to get us to a place where we had kind of the engines we needed fully up and running. And this is the quarter where we're looking to accelerate, and we're seeing that happen. We know what we're doing. We know what will be produced by the way we're doing things today. What we don't know is, if we make some changes to this, how is that going to impact everything, right? And so I think and so for us to make that transition to like really start accelerating, we need to start testing these things. So we need to do it in the bounds of, based on what we know, how can we continue to drive our growth and get to a place where I can start peeling some of that off to start trying other things, right? And so to start experimenting and learning. And in doing that, how do we then start creating the data that gets us from the things I think I know to actually things I know, or things I thought were true that aren't true, right? And so being able to kind of work that, I think sometimes there's this desire to just make like a knee-jerk change. I think we're gonna cut all of our paid ad spending. We're just gonna focus on demand capture, and we're gonna go create content, right? Okay, right? We can do that, and let's hope it works. But at the end of the day, like, you still have a responsibility to the company. So it's balancing that. Here's what I know I need to do, and how do I get enough headroom in here so that I can start experimenting on the things that I think are true. And then as soon as I know that, make that change. And part of that is also like I don't know if you're familiar with like the Bezos decision framework. Like, it's, the more impact and kind of the less chance to draw that thing back, the more you should be certain that you're doing. So like, in understanding what those choices are, like, when am I walking through a one-way door? Well, when I make this choice, there's no going back, right? So I better be really, really certain. Or, hey, I'm going to make this choice and it's going to have an impact, but I can turn this engine off, turn something else back on, and I'll be fine. Knowing how to balance like the level of inspection that's required for each individual decision based upon those factors is really important. And again, as long as you're delivering what you need to deliver to the business, it gives you flexibility to test and try new things. We're kind of going through that right now. Like, if we look at our MQLs, like, which of those actually matter and where are they coming from? And I think the hypothesis I have today is that it's not exactly aligned to what we're doing. So it may be a pretty drastic change that we need to make, but we need to take some steps to get there. So there's a series of two-way doors. before I get to the one that I have to walk through and hope that I don't need to get back inside.
You remind me a little bit of like destructive and non-destructive editing. You're kind of talking about as you think about what you're doing, is this going to be one of those things where like, is it going to be destructive to the point where, and they say this in like when you're doing graphic design or you're using a tool, that there's some editing you can do where you could just as easily turn this setting off and everything snaps back to normal. Yep. Or if you do this, you're essentially overwriting on all the pixels or whatever it is that you're working on, and everything goes, bye-bye. And so it reminds me a little bit of we hitting that point where you're like, oh, if I do this, there could be a win here. It could look really cool. It could do what, come out much better than the previous version. But if I do so and I don't like it, there's no going back. Sort of from here. And it sounds like what you were describing is, especially when you first start, you are kind of working with not knowing what you don't know at that point. And then over a period of time, seeking to understand, like you said, some things with a certain level of certainty so that you can then go, great, now let me like shelve that or set it aside as something we're going to continue to stick with as a tried and true. And then take a percentage of our effort, our resources, our time to go off now and take some chances. That's basically what you're saying, right?
Yeah, more or less. I think how many, like, for every decision, is there a control Z, right? And so I want to make as many small decisions that have a control Z option on them before I make the one where I can't, right? So if I make a significant change to our go-to-market, it means I'm going to have to turn stuff off that's going to take time to bring it back up. Great example, this launching a website. So we launched a new website, right? And so it was a total rebuild of our website. And so it was a series of, okay, this week, if we turn this thing on, what is going to happen, right? And so we had to get ourselves to a place where, all right, when we turn this on, there's no going back. So we better be really certain that things aren't going to break. A bunch of stuff broke. But it wasn't, like we had 404 in our campaigns and stuff for a couple of weeks. But it would have been way worse had we made that decision to press go earlier, right? So that was a one-way door that, okay, now I'm here, I've just got to fix it. And I think to the degree you can avoid that and really make sure you're certain for those big decisions, it just makes things more manageable, and then builds trust in the organization that you're being thoughtful. And you're right. It's, I like that example of destructive editing, right? You don't want to destroy on a hope and a prayer. Like, you want to destroy because it's going to get you to a better place, right? Doing home renovations, I don't want to knock down the load bearing wall because I think I need a walkway here, right? I want to make sure that, like, if I do that, I've got the right support beams in place so my house isn't going to fall down when I do that. So
I love that. Well, we're about to wrap up, but at the end of the episode, what I like to do is give you an opportunity to ask me one question. And it doesn't have to be anything earth-shattering or anything like that, but the only thing it cannot be is why the name Secret Sushi for my agency. That's it. Other than that, and the reason being is simply a lot of people ask that, and I would imagine that if I don't set that stage, that's going to be something that's going to pop up fairly frequently. But other than that, do you have a question for me? It doesn't have to be anything earth-shattering or, preferably around marketing or business, but it doesn't have to be.
Yeah. Well, you talk to a lot of marketers, right? And I think you talk to a lot of people who sit in my seat. I would love to know, kind of, it's a two-part question, so I'm cheating. I'm weaseling one in here, right? First one is, like, what is the thing happening that you're hearing people talk about in the industry that they're most excited about? And what is the thing that they see happening that gives them the most anxiety?
I almost think it's the same thing.
Okay. So you weaseled it back to one.
Yeah. You see how I did that? It was like split and then pulled back
very
together.
Well played. Very well played.
It's things seem to be getting to a point where being the more human elements of marketing are coming back a little bit more, where although they are paying attention to, like attribution and data-driven stuff. And to be honest, those are all the things that I think leadership, that marketing is reporting to, would love to just have, is this kind of, system where you just look at the data and you put, a dollar bill in, and then later on it has babies with other dollar bills that are in the jar, and then they come out more of them. That's actually not really the way that it's working still. It's not the experience that people are having. And so marketers who have been, I don't want to say forced, but pushed in a direction where the art in science, the heart in science of marketing, you're talking to customers. These are human beings. Doesn't always equate to some very linear, like I can measure every little step of the way sort of situation. It's starting to prove that that's not the case. And in addition, it's really more like, it's not just like it's been that way always. It has been that way to some extent, but it's moving in that direction due to a number of different changes that have happened, right? Yeah. So everything from how you can track results and cookies and the way that social media algorithms are favoring, zero-click content and staying directly on those networks. The way that websites, which at one point were the destination for brands, have become not as powerful early on, potentially in some of the buying journeys of the customers. And so I think it's both scary and exciting at the same time that marketers are like, hey, this is as much art to some extent and understanding of the humans that we're working with and we're talking to and engaging with them on these other places as we would expect within our discipline. Yep. And then it gets scary because it's like, so how do we then talk with our stakeholders or our leadership about what do results look like, or having some level of faith in those results, because there's a little bit more of a black box that happens between when you take action with a campaign or with something you're doing with your marketing, and then ultimately when you start to see the echo of the impact that's having. In your experience, are you seeing some of that?
I live that. I feel that, man. Like it is, and it is actually one of the things that I find it fascinating. So you mentioned zero-click search. Like, what is the impact of that going to be on how we think about the buying journey? And then one step either before or after that, I haven't decided yet. Like, what can we do to influence that? Like, what is it that we should be doing today to influence? Zero click, right?
That's the question.
And the thing you're talking about attribution, it's super hard, and it is complicated by the fact that that's the way I tell the story. So I come from DevOps most recently. Like, as things shift left in the DevOps space and the developers are asked to do more, well, budgets are doing the same thing. So now you're having more technical buyers responsible for buying solutions for their team. They buy software very, very differently than the traditional software buying cycle, right? They're going to go, they have a problem. They want to solve the problem. Well, they probably aren't coming to your website. They're probably going to a community. They're probably going to a forum, going to Stack Overflow, wherever it is where people are talking about this thing. And they're going to go learn about it. And then they're going to go look at your documentation. They're going to experiment with it. And I think Gartner cites that, 5% of the whole buying process actually is the last 5% is when they're engaged with sales. I believe that. Yep. And so now you've got this big black box of stuff that they're doing. How do we understand what they're doing, and what are those key moments along the way? But also, how do you thoughtfully, incredibly engage them in a way that doesn't feel like, and it should not be that your intent should not be to sell them at this point, but how do you help them? How do you engage earlier on, say, hey, I saw you, and there's tools that do this, right? Like, there's a bunch of kind of new tools around community engagement. How do you kind of find people earlier? But the motion there is different. It's not, hey, I've got this great solution to solve your problem. It's, hey, I see you're trying to do this thing. Here's how I can help you, right? Let me help you with your implementation. Let me help you answer questions to get them to a place where now that engagement's about adding value before you get to a selling conversation, right? And if you happen to be a company with a SaaS model on top of an open source product, hey, you know what? You've realized you can solve your problem. By the way, we have this SaaS thing that you don't have to manage. You've made the decision, this is what you need, great, go use that. But also we have this other thing that's going to end up saving you money and time and resources.
Sure.
Right. So that whole motion has changed in figuring out how you get to a place where you can have a credible conversation with your finance leader that says, my paid ads are working. I've got no way to show you that these are directly tied deals, but we know that it's starting this set of behaviors because now somebody's aware and now they're taking action, right? And so it's a thing that I think we all have to work through, but that's one of the best parts about marketing is thinking through what is the human behavior that you are trying to influence? How is that human behavior changing over time? And then what are the things you can do with empathy to connect with these people, help them solve their problems so that when they get to the end of their journey, they come to you to say, hey, you know what, I want you to help solve my problem.
See, it all ties back to that psychology degree that you were talking about earlier.
Yeah, I guess I did do something with it, I guess. Yeah.
Well, Michael, I want to talk to you again in the future, but thank you for your time. And I learned a ton about you. And the thing I love about these conversations is every single one of them is absolutely different and unique. And so thank you for the time that you spent with me today.
Yeah, it was my pleasure. I'm excited the podcast is coming back, and I'm super excited that you invited me to be here. So I'd be happy to come back anytime, and thank you for having me on.
Sure thing.